We like to observe these birds and their odd behaviors and interacting with one another. And they were once common across much of Texas. And even though we've got strongholds in a portion of our state, we're really no different than other parts of the range where we've seen massive declines. The range is across the southeastern United States, including some 37 states. Many of those states have seen declines in excess of 90%, 95%. My name is Robert Pettis. I work for Texas Parks and Wildlife. Quail are needy. They need food in the morning. They need a resting place in the middle of the day called a loafing covert. They need some place to go to sleep at night that's suitable roosting cover on their roost. They need very specific habitat types. It seems like the more efficient we become at farming or at forestry or with cattle production, it leaves less and less habitat on the landscape for quail and other grassland birds. We greatly rely on the interaction with our land stewards, our landowners, our land managers, and we try to foster that conservation ethic. And I think we've got example after example, and here at Labrasitas with Mr. Lawrence.
I love it. I love it when they do that. And it's really pretty to hear that. That's when they're in the mating season. That's really a neat sound. They pair off and have their babies. This is a last bastion of really great quail, and I hope it'll last for many generations. I think the landowners and most people realize that's the value of the land, is having the wildlife. When they overshoot it or don't take care of it, it's not good.
Right here, we're leaving our main compound, heading out to our North Trevino pasture. There they go. When we manage for quail, it pretty much manages for the white-tailed deer, dove, turkeys, all types of wildlife. So we have 400 steers on the ranch. In each pasture, we got about 30 to 40 head just to reduce the thick, grassy areas. Every time they take a step, they're manipulating the soil. And right where they manipulate the soil, you get some weed and forb growth, which creates seeds for quail. So cattle are a key wildlife tool if you use it correctly. If you just have thousands of head of cattle out here and they overgraze the terrain, then your quail habitat's gonna go away. Here's where we ran our disc, what we call winter plowing. And what you're doing here is you're disturbing the soil to create a natural food plot. Here, there's not gonna be much grass in here. And it's gonna have a canopy above so they'll feel comfortable and feed in this area and still have enough time to get away if they need to.
Most folks don't realize that the backbone of conservation for all of these species, it's hunters that pay for licenses, it's hunters that pay for stamps. In Texas, there's a $7 upland game bird stamp. And those funds go towards that resource for the biology, the research, the management, the conservation of those species.
Anytime we can get a private landowner that is interested in wildlife one way or another and is willing to conserve that habitat to keep it from being subdivided, we are seeing properties getting smaller and smaller and smaller as we go through the generations. So if we can keep those properties intact, keep that habitat intact.
I've been involved with the Caesar Clayburgh Wildlife Institute in Kingsville, Texas. We get ideas from them and they get ideas from us.
Academic research plays a critical role from my perspective because it provides the scientific basis for the conservation actions and the management that's put on the ground. Management costs a lot of money, and so we want to identify the most effective management strategies based on science. We translate that material into newsletters and other publications and magazine articles and things like that so that we reach our target audience of landowners in the area and the region.
About 30 or so years ago, primary land production was cattle, and they were working cattle ranches. But given the importance of wildlife and the economic revenues that wildlife can create, whether it's ecotourism or through hunting, landowners have really embraced that additional source of revenue, and so They started making management decisions specifically for wildlife. As with other species, the primary cause is habitat loss. As human populations increase and urbanization increases and urban sprawl, habitat is lost, and obviously less habitat means lower populations.
We're here an example of some really good quail habitat. We've got a diversity of cover types in here. We've got a good distribution of woody cover. We have forbs, we have grassy cover, there's bare ground, all of the components that a quail need. Non-native vegetation has been a real issue for bobwhite quail. As these non-native species replace the native species, we see a decline throughout the range, and not only bobwhite quail, but lots of other grassland birds. So there's a whole series of ecosystem functions that can be tied to good bobwhite quail populations, and that's why we think everybody needs to be interested in what's happening to the bobwhite quail.
Unlike the pastures in South Texas, where cattle can coexist with wildlife like quail, many of the grazing lands in the eastern United States have been transformed by the introduction of exotic grasses, destroying the original habitat and creating serious problems for quail and other wild species.
When this land was first settled centuries ago, livestock was grazing on the native grasses that occurred here and grew here naturally and did well for a long time. They started bringing in exotic grasses from other continents. Fescue was one of the premier grasses that the U.S. Department of Agriculture developed and promoted. There's multiple problems with fescue as habitat for wild birds. We are now realizing that there is opportunity to turn back the clock somewhat and replace that fescue with the native grasses that were eradicated decades ago. And the place we're standing now is one of those locations where some of the fescue has been eradicated.
Turning back the clock here in Kentucky, we see how they're doing that in our next report on the bobwhite quail.